Hybrid Cloud Show, Episode 11. I'm Aaron.
I'm Gary.
I'm Sean.
And I'm Shane.
Welcome to the show about public cloud, private cloud, and everything in between. Our views here are ours and not those of our employers. Today, I wanted to talk about how much of the traditional Linux and sysadmin knowledge you need to have in order to have a career in cloud computing. I've been asked it before, and it would be interesting to get your insights.
Let's try to define that. Do we include virtual machines as part of cloud computing? Because that's been legacy sysadmin stuff before.
Yeah, as we unpick the definition, I think we're going to get closer and closer to an answer. I suppose when I think of traditional Linux sysadmin tasks, I'm thinking about those things that you would have to do in a traditional bare metal server, but a lot of those carry over to a virtual machine environment too. It's how much do you have to understand of what a Linux system is doing in order to have a career in cloud computing is sort of how I would think of it.
As always, I think it kind of depends. If you're a level 1 engineer who's come in and your team deploys some containers, then you probably won't be editing the Docker file on your first day, so you won't have to know where to drop the files in the correct folders, right? That'll be done for you by someone who knows what they're doing. But I think definitely as you start to scale up, you start to understand the underlying technologies better, like containers, then yeah, you have to understand Linux file systems, especially Linux permissions. That's a big one.
I think if you're someone contemplating the question of, I want a career in cloud computing, do I need to know the Linux administrative fundamentals? I would say yes. Whilst the cloud abstracts away tons of stuff, you will probably be asked to run or define workflows or operate them, and they'll be all running on Linux, probably. And not having some fundamental knowledge of how networking works, how DNS works, how storage and file systems work, whilst the cloud might abstract that away, things will break. You'll get weird edge cases. You will really struggle to go beyond surface level without some Linux system administrative skills. If you are considering that career in cloud computing, if you're an engineer who is handed a platform and they've abstracted it away well enough so you don't need to think about it, then you can probably lean on them to be the subject matter experts. But that's if you're going down a pure engineering route, I think.
Yeah, I think it's probably, for me, similar to what Shane said. You probably need to understand file system, permissions, how kind of the very basics of how a Linux box works, probably 200 level-ish, if I had to put a number on it. And then it's useful to understand things like networks, how traffic flows work, how routing works, what ports things are listening on, how to expose those. All of the security practices which you would apply on-prem and then some are things that you need to know. So I think there is a large amount that's relevant. I think when we were talking off air, some of the things we were thinking about were you probably don't need to understand how a RAID controller works because that's something that's abstracted away for you. You probably don't need to understand the difference between multi-mode and single-mode fiber. You probably don't need to understand cooling and power requirements and all of that sort of thing that a sysadmin historically would have really thought about.
Is that any different from coming into any other role, though, in the sense that you're coming in, you've got a whole lot of stuff you've got to learn? I'm thinking some of the nuance to this question would be people looking at the cloud computing industry and saying, can I go straight into that? Or is that something where I need some experience in understanding Linux systems before I move into cloud computing? Is there a barrier there, or is it just as easy to go into cloud computing without the background in Linux sysadmin as it is to try and go through Linux sysadmin on the way to being a cloud computing expert?
For me, I think if you ask several different people, you'll get several different answers. Say, I'm from more of a sysadmin type background, and my bias there means that I think it's actually really useful to understand the fundamental building blocks that make up the cloud services, right? So if you think about RDS and you understand that actually that's just a Linux box running MySQL or Postgres somewhere, it becomes much easier for you to understand the potential failure modes. It becomes much easier for you to talk to a support engineer who might be helping you with that than if you just think it's a black box and I get a connection string and I connect to a database, which is something that I've seen a lot of newer DBAs fall into. Like the database goes down. They don't really grep the concept that it is just a Linux box. Likewise, when you're doing capacity planning and things in the cloud, understanding that AWS or Azure are just running a bunch of hypervisors somewhere, and they have the same capacity constraints that you would on-prem, right? Sometimes they run out of a certain instance type, and you need to understand that that's a thing that can happen. You can work around it. Equally, I've spoken to architects and kind of architect managers who say that they prefer hiring people from a development background who don't maybe understand as much of the infrastructure stuff, because they can deal with the high-level 100, 200 type concepts that they need to know about in the cloud. So networking, security, all that stuff that we thought about before. But actually what they're really good at is understanding how APIs work and how domain-driven design might affect their application versus some other type of architecture pattern. So those things are a subset of things that I think probably make a good cloud engineer. Equally, there are a whole bunch of other things that those cloud engineers perhaps aren't quite as good at as the ones who come from the more sysadmin infrastructure type background.
Yes, and I suppose there's sysadmins and sysadmins in the sense that there's a difference when you're talking about massive scale workloads in the cloud between having experience trying to solve those problems with scale out workloads with Linux servers versus just experience with a single server sitting somewhere, which you're solving different problems. So you'll have less experience with the pieces around the scale out workloads and the challenges some of those bits bring.
Yeah, I think there's something to be said for, I've run some workloads on a VPS, therefore I understand how Linux works and I understand how permissions and all that kind of thing works. That makes someone probably the type of person who I would want to recruit into a junior level position, because it shows they're keen and that they're interested in understanding what some of those lower level concepts are, and then you can teach them the high level stuff. I think equally, sometimes there are the more developer or architect type people who are a lot better at thinking about what are the failure modes for an application or how does it scale, etc., etc.
I'm curious as to how understanding domain-driven design makes you a better cloud engineer.
Well, maybe not necessarily domain-driven design, but certainly an understanding of various different software architecture patterns is probably what I should have said there. If you understand how to build applications that are loosely coupled with things like message queuing or things like that in between them, that probably makes you a slightly better cloud architect, I would argue.
That makes a lot of sense. Yeah, totally agree.
And I think that is one of the things that is maybe something that we concatenate together that we shouldn't, is that there is a difference between being a cloud engineer and being someone who is architecting workloads to run on the cloud. One of them, you could probably get away with a lot of the sysadmin skills and run workloads on cloud. The other one would be able to architect applications to make use of the cloud effectively. But really, I think a good cloud engineer has both of those knowledge pieces. It's no good me being a sysadmin with a bunch of Linux knowledge who deploys and manages workloads in the cloud in the same way that I would on premises, because it's just going to lead to a really hard time when there's ever an issue with the cloud.
Yeah, you are ultimately, just like when you're coding, you're managing complexity, and being able to understand the business in which you're trying to model and represent in a cloud architecture is a really, really useful skill. And I think it's one we definitely don't consider when we're thinking about these roles and these career paths.
You're much closer to the logic of the application, and you're much closer to what the actual business requirements are. And your job almost goes from looking after the servers that run those applications that someone else has written to kind of being a core part of what makes the business operate. Not that sysadmins aren't, right? But I think they're often seen as someone who is supporting the business rather than enabling things like business growth and stuff.
So that in your mind, there's cloud engineer and there's cloud architect, right? Which is above that. And eventually a cloud engineer can grow into a cloud architect? Or do you think to be a cloud architect, you have to kind of be a full stack engineer and know how to develop software, know how to use platforms effectively, know how to do networking, the whole shebang?
I think we've mentioned before, I don't really buy into the full stack engineering concept, but I do think that having a knowledge of the one that you are not quite as strong in is a useful thing. Right? I don't profess to be a developer. I'm really an infrastructure guy at heart, but what I've done is made sure that I'm aware of those high-level development concepts and how you might implement them. And equally, I would expect that someone who is a really strong developer would make sure that they understood things like networking, security, that basic Linux knowledge, how container runtimes work, what's going on behind the scenes in a managed database or whatever. So I actually think that you need to be a mix of both. And that actually, if you are building an engineering organization, you almost want to have an even split of people who are stronger on the architecture side and people who are stronger on the infrastructure side.
Okay, well then I kind of want to get back to sysadmin versus cloud ops and this kind of shift that we're seeing left. Because it used to be we had the devs and then we had the ops, right? The sysadmins and the developers. And then we brought them together and that was DevOps. And now we're kind of going back towards platform engineering and devs. And curious as to why do you guys think that is? Because it sounds like, Gary, what you're talking about is you kind of want to have a good split between platform engineers who know what they do and they give good guardrails to the devs, and then the devs who know how to take full advantage of the platforms they're given.
I think some of the answer to that is that the roles and responsibilities are a bit different. My understanding of the DevOps lifecycle, or whatever you call it, the sort of responsibility figure of 8 that you see drawn up when people talk DevOps, a lot of that is around understanding your application lifecycle and making sure that you are planning it and then deploying it, and then you're learning from what you've deployed and you're making changes to your application. And I think you can do that even if someone has abstracted away some of those cloud-specific concepts in a platform engineering role in a way that they couldn't when you had one team that was developing an application and handing it off to a traditional infrastructure team to deploy on more traditional hardware. So I do think that there is at least an evolution there that has helped in the person developing the application having more understanding of the life cycle that goes around that application. But I do see your point.
And I think the bottom line is that DevOps, in reality, when you were working fully in an embedded team, always played out that there were the few people who wanted to write the application and there were the few people who wanted to go and deploy the cloud services. So although you were working in one embedded team on a product and you kind of fully understood what that product did and the business value it delivered and the life cycle for it, the bottom line is that when I was working deploying machine learning stacks on OpenShift, I was still effectively just looking after the infrastructure part of that, right? I wasn't writing the Java or the microservices and things like that. Equally, I would have conversations into, how do we use something like a service mesh to let our microservices talk to each other? So I think there were valuable conversations that were had, and there were good things about bringing those teams closer together. I think what platform engineering enables is for those standards that I would have been talking to the developers in the team I was in about to be standardized across an organization. So, this is how we do service mesh. This is how we deploy containers. These are the standard setups that we have for a database. And it just removes that ambiguity where my team looking after component A might have done things one way because I, as an infrastructure guy, was having conversations with developers and we were going down one path and another team was going down another path.
Yeah, I would say I think there's definitely a sort of mindset of platform engineering can be a platform team sitting on the side and the engineers are over here on the other side of this diagram. And that can be true, and that's a way to operate the team. But also you can have platform engineers embedded in each team. And as Gary says, you're no longer, I'm solving problems for my team. It's, I'm extending this platform for this larger group of platform engineers and engineers in general. So I think it makes sense, right? You want to reduce the amount of snowflakes, and just repeatedly solving the same problem is just a waste of time. So it feels like a natural evolution from DevOps platform engineering. So I think that's probably why this has happened. And it's a lot to do as well with just how bloody complicated it can all get as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think if you think about that Spotify model for structuring an engineering team, having a guild of platform engineers who are all embedded in a specific team and doing their own thing, but are all singing to the same hymn sheet as to how the infrastructure and the networking and the overarching architecture works, is a really valuable thing to have.
Guild sounds a lot cooler than I'm guessing it is.
Yeah. I mean, you basically just have an architecture or platform engineering team meeting once a month, don't you? That's what it boils down to.
Guilds can be good, but yes, oftentimes they can't get a lot done as well because they've all got day jobs to do. But yes, yeah, there's probably a lot of reason why. Then you have the isolated platform engineering team that's got its own investment, doesn't need to beg their boss for 10% of their time to make the platform better. So yeah, it's definitely depends on your culture, your company, really.
Pros and cons to every single approach, as with most things in the cloud space, right?
There's been a bit of standardization there too, right? And that you've now got containers, which gives people a sort of common language to think about a certain amount of platform that comes with your application and a certain amount of expectations around where those interfaces are between some of the things you're doing.
Sure, but it only goes so far, right? There are a bunch of workloads within any given organization that don't lend themselves to containers. They might lend themselves better to running on a traditional VM, and you've got to decide as an organization on an approach for that. They might lend themselves to being some kind of step function. They might lend themselves to being some kind of serverless thing if you need infinite and quick scale, which containers can do, but maybe aren't the best at.
Yeah, if you're like considering that career in cloud computing and you want to believe that, I'll just work in Lambdas and I'll never need to look at a box ever, someone will come along with a workload that will never work in that compute type and you will need to be able to deal with that. So yeah, bearing that in mind. One question I had that's maybe slightly off topic, but going back to the original question of like, do you do, Linux administration stuff before the cloud stuff? I'm actually in two minds. Is there a risk, and I say this as someone who's probably already fallen into this trap of just becoming like whatever cloud vendor you pick first like I'm now the AWS or Azure expert and that's it. And I don't really even understand the fundamentals of Linux. I don't know what that mindset's like because I have a decent amount of experience in Linux and system administration. If I didn't have that and went way into AWS, my mental model is AWS now. It's not Azure. It's not GKE, So what do people think?
I think that's already happening. There are a bunch of people that I could point at and say they haven't done the old school sysadmin stuff. And that makes them really great at knowing AWS or knowing Azure or knowing GCP, but it doesn't necessarily make them a generalist. And I don't think that they would find it as easy as perhaps someone who understands some of those lower level concepts would to go and walk into work on a set of infrastructure that's already in production in the other cloud provider.
I guess that's not as much of a risk as you're getting started, right? I know 0 cloud technologies right now. One is better than none, so I'll just go down AWS route rather than try go for something that kind of skills that fit across all, which might be more of your Linux administrators and stuff.
Well, I feel like if you went the cloud way first, right? You learned AWS first, and then you try to port that over to GKE or Azure or something, you're going to have a harder time because there's so many products, and trying to draw parallels between what GKE offers and what like AWS offers, what's the same product? You might not know. And once you figure that out, it doesn't translate to Azure. But if I know what a load balancer is from my sysadmin days, and I understand how that works as a general concept, then I can go to the cloud and be like, okay, now what load balancers do you offer, right? And then I can choose the right one for me.
I don't know. I've seen as many people who will come into that conversation and say, what's the Azure equivalent of some AWS product or whatever, as they would to say that thing for a traditional service.
If you have experts, then it makes it easy, right? Then somebody else knows what the translation is. But if you don't, you can search the docs for a long time or what?
Yeah, it's tricky. I could tell you that the equivalent of Aurora is Cosmos DB, or I could tell you the equivalent of S3 is Azure Blob Store. And I think for those core services, having an understanding of like what they are across the clouds it's not difficult. I think understanding the nuance and the minutiae of how you implement those in a successful and correct and reliable way is probably a bit more difficult. So it's very easy to be master of one, and it's very difficult to be jack of all, for want of a better term. I think I would find it hard now, having worked extensively with AWS for 4 years, to walk back into an environment where I'm only deploying stuff in Azure like I was for the preceding 5 years. Would I find it hard to walk back into an environment where everything was on-prem and the core concepts that I still know apply? Probably not, actually. I would rather walk into somewhere where everything was on-prem than walk into somewhere running GKE or Oracle.
Is that because you're not translating one language to another? You're translating to like the base language almost.
Yeah, like I'd almost have to go back to, I would like a serverless database. What do I deploy? And then from there, I'm then like working up to all of the specifics of going and deploying whatever Oracle's serverless database is. It's a much bigger learning curve, I think, to go from one cloud provider to another and do it well than it is just to go back to those core concepts that I learned early in my career when I was doing on-prem sysadmin stuff.
Absolutely agree.
So does it sound like our direction would be take a stab at one of the clouds, but if you get a taste for this, then go back to the fundamentals a bit, perhaps? Now that you've got AWS for free, in quotes, try build it yourself.
I think it's really difficult because I've never been in a world where I haven't had to do the on-prem stuff and learn those core concepts first. So I don't really know what it would be like to walk straight into an environment where there is no on-premises stuff that I have to worry about and I'm jumping straight into learning the cloud. I think I would still say learn the core concepts of like how networking works, how security groups work, how things like IAM work, and use those as your baseline concepts that you then translate back to if you're moving between different clouds, perhaps.
I will say that a lot of people get into what the broad term of cloud from weird places, and people get jobs in roles they get jobs in, and they learn to do the job that they're paid to do, and if they're good, they'll probably do some work to understand the concepts around what it is they have to do in their job. But in terms of kind of gatekeeping it with, this is, the list of things you should absolutely do, I just don't think in a space as amorphous as cloud, that's really how it has to work. I've seen a huge number of people recently coming over to Linux for the first time on the clouds because they are moving from traditional .NET deployments on Windows to containers running Ubuntu with the .NET frameworks and all the rest on that container, and they're learning just enough about a Linux container to make that run on a hosted container service or whatever. And that is what they know about Linux, and it's enough to know about their particular use case. Now, obviously, I come into those conversations and I want them to know a bit more about Linux, but that's fine. We've each got our part to play, and I think it is a big industry.
And I think that brings us full circle back to our initial question of what do you define as sysadmin skills, or what do you define as working in the cloud, right? There are a bunch of people where their experience of sysadmining would have been RDPing or SSHing onto a box on a set of infrastructure that someone else looked after. And the move to cloud for them is just, I'm RDPing or SSHing to a box that is on a cloud provider and not on a vSphere cluster in a data center somewhere. There are also people who they would click deploy in a Jenkins pipeline and their .NET application or their Java application would be deployed. And for them, if they want to then go and deploy that on a serverless thing, they just learn the serverless thing. So I think you're right. It's really difficult to answer the question without knowing where someone is coming from and what their intended destination is. But I think what we probably all agree on is that an understanding of those core concepts can't really harm anything.
We seem to be coming to this conclusion a lot in these discussions. I think we came to a similar place in the Kubernetes discussion where we said, look, you can just dive in and start playing and you're fine, and you'll probably be able to find someone who'll pay you for it if you're any good at it. But if you want to really understand why things aren't working as you would think they should work, you have to start peeling back the layers of the onion.
Yeah, like in your model, I could go and take my .NET application, port it to .NET Core and go and run it on some managed container platform, which is great until something goes wrong and I can't talk to this database over here that I think I should be able to talk to, or a node in the cluster goes down and I don't quite understand where the bounds of responsibility for that particular node are. So you're right. It entirely depends on what it is you're trying to achieve, the organization you're working in, how that's structured. There's a million different buts.
Even sysadmin is a very loose term, as you hinted at. And I think when we were talking about the infrastructure as code episode, where we talk about some of the ways that the people here all work on infrastructure as code for their home labs or whatever, that's completely different to what a lot of people would think of when they thought of traditional sysadmin. And some of those concepts are going to port over to a cloud computing job are much easier than if you've been doing everything manually and you don't have that approach of cattle versus pets or whatever.
I think that comes back to Gary's point about the developer mindset. You know, I want to automate this. I want it to be reproducible. I want that software bill of materials, all the things you get for free when you just engineer things the right way. I think that mindset's the most important thing to have, whatever problem you're facing in cloud.
Shit, I'm just lazy. I don't want to rack and stack servers. I just want to write 20 lines of YAML and be done.
Exactly.
YAML engineering. That's what we're all here for.
But then you don't get to hide in the server room on a cold day.
I used to work for a place that did hosting and all of that sort of thing. And one of the things we used to do when we brought on a big customer was take them to see the actual data center. And the number of people even back then that you would take into a data center that had never seen the servers that they ran their workloads on was quite something.
I'll always remember moving building in a previous job and the CEO asking for there to be a glass door into the hallway from the server room so that customers could come in and see them. And we always tried to explain to him that their first question would be, why are they here?
That's a good first question.
Right, so I think we've concluded at the end of a whole episode talking about it that the question was stupid. So on that note, shall we wrap it up? And before we do that, I will say thank you very much to our supporters on PayPal and Patreon. If you'd like to join those people, you can if you go to hybridcloudshow.com/support. If you have any feedback or questions, please send it in to show@hybridcloudshow.com. Thanks for listening. We'll be back in 2 weeks. I've been Aaron.
I've been Gary.
I've been Sean.
And I've been Shane.
See you later.